Elizabeth Crawford walked carefully along West 63rd Street, her canvas tote bag filled with donated medical supplies for the Englewood Community Center. At 68 years old, her gait was slower than it used to be, not from weakness, but from the 2 herniated discs that had settled into her lower back after 4 decades of lifting patients in understaffed hospital wards. Her natural gray coils were twisted into a low bun beneath a simple headscarf, and despite the worn soles of her practical shoes barely visible beneath her modest coat, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had saved lives. She had volunteered for 3 years. 3 long years of teaching CPR to teenagers, checking blood pressure for seniors who couldn't afford doctors, and walking 2 miles each way because her fixed income left no room for ride shares. All to give back to the neighborhood that had raised her. The only place that still felt like home after her husband's death and her children's moves to distant cities. The intersection at Halsted was busy that October evening, filled with cars rushing through yellow lights and pedestrians absorbed in their phones, conducting lives that Elizabeth watched with the detached patience of someone who had seen generations come and go. She felt invisible here, but she had every right to exist in this space. Her presence was earned through service and sacrifice and the stubborn refusal to abandon a community that everyone else had written off. The rain had started 20 minutes earlier, turning the asphalt slick and reflective under the streetlights. Elizabeth waited for the walk signal, her tote bag growing heavier against her shoulder. The white crossing light blinked on. She stepped into the crosswalk, her eyes scanning the traffic as she'd been taught 60 years ago in a Chicago that no longer existed. She never saw the car. The black Audi sedan ran the red light at 50 miles per hour, its driver glancing down at a glowing phone screen. The impact threw Elizabeth 12 feet. Her body hit the pavement with a sickening crack that echoed off the brick buildings. The tote bag exploded, scattering bandages and antiseptic bottles across the wet street like confetti at a funeral no one wanted to attend. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from, hit the subscribe button and turn on post notification as I have another beautiful story for you tomorrow and I do not want you to miss it. For 3 seconds, the intersection was silent except for the hiss of rain and the fading roar of the Audi's engine disappearing into the night. Then came the footsteps. Not running toward her but stopping at a safe distance. Elizabeth tried to lift her head, tried to call for help, but her lungs wouldn't fill. Blood pooled beneath her, mixing with rainwater flowing toward the gutter. Through blurred vision she saw them. 5 people. Then 8. Standing in a semicircle around her broken body, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their phones. They were filming her. Not calling 911. Not kneeling to check her pulse or cradle her head or whisper that help was coming. Just recording. Capturing her suffering for an audience of strangers who would watch her die between advertisements for luxury cars and vacation packages. Elizabeth's vision darkened at the edges. The rain felt colder. She thought of her husband, of her children, of the 4 decades she'd spent healing people who never knew her name. And she thought, with a clarity that felt like betrayal, that this was how society had decided she would end. Alone. Ignored. Reduced to content. Then the headlights stopped. 3 black Mercedes SUVs pulled to the curb in perfect synchronization, their engines purring like predators at rest. The phone cameras swiveled toward the vehicles, sensing a more interesting story unfolding. The rear door of the center SUV opened. A man stepped out into the rain. Masakazu Hino was dressed in a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like armor. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of intricate Irizumi tattoos that crawled up his neck like smoke. His hair was swept back, rain beating on the dark strands. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of controlled stillness that suggested violence was always an option, never a surprise. His hands, emerging from French cuffs, bore more tattoos across the knuckles and the backs of his palms, traditional Yakuza art that marked him as a man who had made irreversible choices. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Elizabeth. His men emerged from the other vehicles, 6 of them, all dressed in black, all moving with military precision. They formed a perimeter, gently but firmly pushing the phone-wielding spectators back. Masakazu walked through the rain as if it didn't exist, his expensive shoes splashing through Elizabeth's blood without hesitation. He knelt beside her on one knee, his suit soaking through, and his expression shifted from cold assessment to something more complicated, recognition perhaps, or memory. He spoke softly in Japanese first, then switched to English, his accent slight but distinct. Can you hear me? Don't try to move. I'm going to help you. Elizabeth's eyes focused on him with effort. He saw the tattoos, the expensive suit, the men standing guard. She understood, in the way a nurse who'd worked in Chicago emergency rooms understands, exactly what kind of man had stopped for her. And she understood that he had stopped when no one else would. Why? She whispered, the word costing her everything. Masakazu's jaw tightened. For a moment, something raw crossed his face. Grief, rage, regret, all compressed into a single breath. Then it was gone, replaced by command. Because no one should die on the street while people watch. He turned his head slightly, barking orders in Japanese to his men. One of them was already on the phone, speaking rapidly. Another opened the SUV's rear door. Masakazu slid his arms beneath Elizabeth's body with surprising gentleness, as if he'd done this before, as if he knew exactly how to lift someone whose ribs might be broken and whose spine might be compromised. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, cradling her against his chest. Elizabeth's blood soaked into his suit, turning the charcoal fabric black. No hospital, he said to the man on the phone. Take us to Dr. Nakamura. Tell him to prep the surgical suite. Now. The crowd of spectators, still filming, parted in silence as Masakazu carried Elizabeth to the SUV. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of warmth, of motion, of a voice speaking softly in a language she didn't understand but that sounded impossibly like prayer. The last thing Elizabeth Crawford saw before darkness claimed her was the interior of the Mercedes, soft leather and the scent of expensive cologne, and the face of the man who held her. A face that belonged to someone who had chosen to be her salvation in a world that had chosen to let her die. The convoy pulled away from the intersection, leaving behind only scattered medical supplies, a pool of diluted blood, and a crowd of people who would post their videos with hashtags about faith and humanity, never realizing they had been the very absence of it. Masakazu's fingers moved across Elizabeth's wrist, finding her pulse with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in field medicine. His touch was clinical, impersonal, yet somehow careful. He spoke in rapid Japanese, his tone shifting between soft reassurance and sharp command. Michibiku, he whispered to Elizabeth, though she couldn't understand. I will guide you. Then louder in English, stay with me. Focus on my voice. His eyes scanned her body with frightening precision, the unnatural angle of her left leg, the shallow rise of her chest, the blood pooling beneath her ribs. He'd seen this before. Too many times. He knew exactly how little time she had. Call Dr. Nakamura, he barked without looking up, his voice cutting through the rain like a blade. Tell him massive internal trauma, possible spinal involvement. I need a surgical suite in 20 minutes. He paused, his jaw tightening. Clear the street. Move these vultures back. And no police yet, not until I say. His men moved instantly, a choreographed dance of authority and intimidation. The spectators retreated, their phones still raised but their feet shuffling backward under the weight of cold stares and expensive suits that promised consequences. Masakazu slid his arms beneath Elizabeth with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his appearance. He adjusted his grip, supporting her neck, cradling her spine, lifting her as if she were made of glass. Her blood soaked through his suit immediately, spreading across the charcoal fabric in dark blooms. He didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. He rose smoothly to his feet and carried her to the waiting SUV. Go, he commanded as he slid into the back seat, still holding Elizabeth across his lap. Nakamura's clinic. Fast but smooth, no sudden stops. The convoy accelerated into the rain-slicked night, weaving through traffic with practiced aggression. Elizabeth's consciousness flickered like a dying bulb. She saw fragments. The leather interior, the city lights streaming past the tinted windows, Masakazu's face above hers, unexpectedly focused, unexpectedly present. His hand pressed against the worst of her wounds, applying pressure, keeping her tethered to life through sheer will. Not yet, he murmured in Japanese then English. You don't get to die on me. Not tonight. Elizabeth's first conscious thought was that heaven had better lighting than she'd expected. Soft, indirect, almost clinical. Her second thought was that heaven probably didn't come with the steady beep of cardiac monitors or the antiseptic smell of medical-grade disinfectant. She opened her eyes slowly, her vision swimming into focus on a ceiling of pale cream and recessed fixtures that belonged in a luxury hotel, not a hospital. The room was impossibly pristine. Equipment she recognized from medical journals but had never seen in person lined the walls. Digital displays showing her vitals in real time, and 4 stand with medication she knew cost more per bag than her monthly rent. The bed itself adjusted automatically to her breathing, supporting her body with a precision that spoke of technology decades ahead of Cook County General, where she'd spent most of her career. The door opened without a sound. A Japanese man in his 60s entered, wearing surgical scrubs beneath a white coat embroidered with his name, Dr. H. Nakamura, Trauma Surgery. His movements were economical, professional kind. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, his English impeccable. "Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare." Elizabeth's voice came out as a rasp. "Where?" "A private facility." He checked her chart on a tablet, his expression revealing nothing. "You sustained 4 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe internal bleeding in your abdomen, and a grade 3 concussion. We repaired the damage surgically. You're stable now, but—" He met her eyes with the unflinching honesty of a man who'd delivered bad news before. "If you had waited for an ambulance, Mrs. Crawford, you would not have survived. The internal bleeding alone would have killed you within 15 minutes. The words settled over her like a shroud. 15 minutes. She'd been that close. "Who?" she started, but the door opened again. Masakazu Hino entered as if stepping into a boardroom, not a hospital room. He'd changed into a fresh suit, midnight blue this time, paired with a black shirt that made the tattoos on his neck seem even more pronounced. He stood at a respectful distance from her bed, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his posture formal, almost deferential. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, nodding slightly. "I'm glad to see you awake." Dr. Nakamura excused himself with a quiet word in Japanese. Masakazu's response was equally soft, but Elizabeth caught the tone: gratitude, command, dismissal. The door closed, leaving them alone. Elizabeth studied him with a nurse's practiced eye. He was composed, controlled, but there was something underneath. A tension in his shoulders, a shadow in his expression. She'd seen it before in family members who'd watched someone die and carried the weight of it afterward. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she'd whispered on the street. "You needed help." His answer was smooth, practiced, deflecting. "So did a dozen other people on that street every day. You don't stop for all of them." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked away toward the window where rain still streaked the glass, and for a moment the mask slipped. Elizabeth saw it clearly: grief, old and deep, worn smooth by years but never truly healed. "You lost someone," she said quietly. Not a question. A recognition. Masakazu's eyes returned to hers, darker now, unguarded. He was silent for a long moment, weighing something internal. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost hollow. "My mother. Baka. I was 12. He paused, the words clearly costing him. "She collapsed on the street coming home from work. People walked past her. Stepped over her. No one stopped. By the time someone finally called for help." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Elizabeth felt the familiar ache of understanding, the kind that only comes from witnessing too much preventable tragedy. "I'm sorry." "So am I." He straightened, rebuilding the walls she'd briefly seen through. "You reminded me of her." "I couldn't." He stopped himself. "I won't let it happen again. Not when I can prevent it." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her ribs protesting the movement. He understood now. This wasn't charity. It wasn't kindness. It was penance. And she, through no choice of her own, had become the recipient of a debt he'd been trying to repay for 30 years. 2 weeks of recovery passed in the strange luxury of Dr. Nakamura's facility, where Elizabeth was treated like visiting royalty by a staff who asked no questions and accepted no insurance information. On the morning of her discharge, Masakazu arrived with an envelope thick enough to contain her entire year's income. "For your expenses," he said, extending it toward her. "Medical bills, lost wages, whatever you need. Or I can arrange a new apartment, something safer, better maintained. Wherever you'd like." Elizabeth looked at the envelope as if it were a live snake. I don't want your money, Mrs. Crawford. I said no. Her voice was firm despite her lingering weakness. I appreciate what you did. I do. But I'm not for sale and I don't need saving beyond what you've already done. Masakazu's expression flickered with something between respect and frustration. Then what do you need? A ride home. To my apartment. In Englewood. His jaw tightened. That neighborhood is my home, she interrupted. I've lived there for 32 years. My church is there. My volunteer work is there. My life is there. She met his eyes with the steady gaze of a woman who'd spent decades refusing to be moved by wealth or intimidation. I'm not running from my life because you pulled me out of the street. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Masakazu nodded once, sharp and decisive. I'll take you myself. The ride through Chicago's South Side was quiet except for the hum of the Mercedes engine. Elizabeth watched familiar streets roll past, corner stores she knew by name, churches where she'd attended funerals, blocks where she'd taught teenagers CPR. Home. Imperfect, struggling, but hers. When they pulled up to her modest apartment building, 3 stories of tired brick and iron fire escapes, Masakazu killed the engine but didn't move to open her door. His hands remained on the steering wheel, knuckles tight. You have been seen with me, he said carefully, his accent thickening slightly with the weight of what he was trying to convey. In my world that means something. It makes you visible to people you don't want noticing you. Elizabeth gathered her belongings, the few items the hospital had salvaged from the accident. Then maybe you should be more careful about who sees you doing good deeds. Mrs. Crawford. I don't know what world you're talking about, Mr. Hino, and I don't want to know. She opened the door herself, moving carefully to protect her healing ribs. Thank you for saving my life. But that's where this ends. I'm going back to my normal life and you can go back to yours. Masakazu watched her climb the steps to her building, his expression unreadable. He didn't drive away until she was safely inside, the door locked behind her. Even then he sat for a long moment, staring at the building, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing about this was over. Some debts once created could never be fully paid. Some connections once made could never be cleanly severed. He'd saved her life. But in doing so he might have endangered it in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Elizabeth first noticed the black SUV on her third morning home. It was parked across from her building, engine off, windows tinted dark enough to be illegal. The same vehicle was there when she left for the community center. And when she returned that evening. And the next morning. By the 4th day her patience had evaporated. She crossed the street with her cane, a temporary necessity from the accident, and rapped sharply on the driver's window. It lowered smoothly, revealing a young Asian man in a dark suit, his expression polite but utterly impassive. Can I help you? He asked as if he weren't the one sitting outside her home. You can leave, Elizabeth said flatly. I don't need a babysitter. I'm just parked here, ma'am. Don't insult my intelligence. You're one of his men. She gestured at the vehicle. Same SUV from the convoy. Tell Mr. Hino I said thank you but no thank you. Go home. The man's expression softened with something almost like sympathy. I can't do that. Hino sends orders, ma'am. Then I'll tell him myself. Finding Masakazu proved easier than she'd expected. A few pointed questions to people in the neighborhood who knew things they shouldn't, and she had an address. A downtown high-rise on West Wacker Drive, the kind of building where the lobby had marble floors and the security wore earpieces. Elizabeth walked past the security desk with the confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years navigating hospital hierarchies, ignoring the guards' protests as she stepped into an elevator. The penthouse button required a key card. She pressed the floor just below it instead. She found Masakazu in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. He was on the phone, speaking rapid Japanese, but his eyes found her immediately. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by resignation. He ended the call. Mrs. Crawford. This is unexpected. Call off your guards, Elizabeth said without preamble. I don't want them. I don't need them. Masakazu set down his phone with careful precision. I can't do that. You can't or you won't? Both. He gestured to a chair. She remained standing. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. the first genuinely weary gesture she'd seen from him. My enemies have eyes everywhere, Mrs. Crawford. They watch me. They watch everyone I interact with. They saw me carry you from that street. They saw me take you to Dr. Nakamura's facility. So to them you are now leverage. His voice was quiet but edged with something harder. You are a weakness they can exploit. A person I care about enough to risk exposure for. That makes you valuable. That makes you a target. Elizabeth felt ice settle in her stomach. I didn't ask for this. I know. His expression was genuinely apologetic. But I cannot unring that bell. The moment I stopped for you, you became visible. And in my world, visibility is dangerous. He met her eyes. The guards stay. Not as a courtesy. As a necessity. Because if something happens to you because of me, I will burn this city to the ground finding who did it. The guards are as much for them as for you. A warning that you are protected. Elizabeth stared at him, fury and fear warring in her chest. What kind of life are you living? Not one I would choose for you, Masakazu said quietly. But one you're now part of, whether either of us wants it or not. Elizabeth's voice cut through the office like a scalpel. If I'm part of your world now, then I deserve to know what world that is. The truth. All of it. Masakazu studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Finally he nodded. Come with me. He led her to a private elevator that required both a key card and a fingerprint scan. The penthouse. The doors opened onto a space that was more fortress than home. Minimalist, expensive, with artwork that probably cost more than her building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago stretching toward the lake. Masakazu poured himself whiskey from a crystal decanter but didn't offer her any. He needed this conversation to have distance, formality. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of pretense. I am the Oyabun, the boss, of the Hinogumi. We control trafficking routes from the West Coast to the Midwest. Gambling operations in 6 states. Loan sharking, extortion, protection rackets. He took a slow sip, his gaze fixed on the skyline. We move heroin weapons, people. We corrupt officials, intimidate witnesses, eliminate rivals. I have ordered men killed. I have killed men myself. He turned to face her fully. I am not a good man, Mrs. Crawford. I stopped being good a long time ago. Elizabeth felt the words like blows, each one confirming what she'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from anger and something more complicated. She'd spent 40 years healing people and this man spent his days destroying them. I've seen evil, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. In emergency rooms at 3 in the morning. In the eyes of men who beat their wives. In the bureaucrats who let people die because they couldn't pay. I know what it looks like. She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. So I have one question for you and I want the truth. Did you choose to save me to feel less guilty about the harm you cause? Was I your absolution? Masakazu's mask cracked. The question had found something raw, something he'd been avoiding examining himself. He set down the whiskey glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady. I don't know, he admitted, and the honesty in those 3 words cost him visibly. Maybe. Probably. I saw you lying there and I saw my mother. I saw every person I've hurt, every life I've destroyed. And I thought. He stopped, jaw working. I thought maybe I could save one. Just one. And maybe that would mean something. Does it? Elizabeth asked quietly. Does saving me balance the scale? No. The answer was immediate, unflinching. Nothing balances that scale. But my respect for you, that's real. My commitment to keeping you safe, that's real. Whatever my reasons were for stopping, what I feel now isn't about guilt or redemption. It's about you. Elizabeth absorbed this, her nurse's pragmatism warring with her moral compass. She'd always believed people could change, could choose differently. But she'd also seen enough of the world to know that some choices carved paths that couldn't be walked back from. I need time to think, she said finally. About all of this. About what it means. Masakazu nodded, his expression carefully neutral. The guards remain. Non-negotiable. I know. She moved toward the elevator, then paused. Mr. Hino? Thank you for telling me the truth. Even if I wish the truth were different. She left him standing in his fortress overlooking the city he controlled through fear and violence. a man powerful enough to command empires but powerless to change what he'd become. The safe house was a nondescript brownstone in Lincoln Park, the kind of property that blended seamlessly into old money neighborhoods. Dr. Nakamura met them at the door, already prepared with a surgical kit for Masakazu's shoulder. Elizabeth sat in the living room while the doctor worked in the adjacent room, her hands still trembling, adrenaline finally giving way to the full weight of what had just happened. When Masakazu emerged 20 minutes later, his arm in a sling and his shirt replaced with a clean black t-shirt that exposed more of his tattoos, Elizabeth was waiting. Her fear had crystallized into something harder. "You brought this into my life," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I was invisible. I was safe. And then you stopped for me and now I've been kidnapped, terrorized, nearly killed, all because of you." Masakazu didn't flinch from the accusation. "You're right." The simple admission caught her off guard. She'd expected excuses, justifications, the deflections men like him specialized in. Instead, he sat down across from her, his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. "I did this to you," he continued. "And I can't undo it. But I can give you choices." He leaned forward, his good hand clasped loosely between his knees. "Option 1, I give you a new life. New identity, new city, anywhere you want. Financial security for the rest of your days. You disappear completely from my world, from Chicago, from everything. You get to start over, safe, free." Elizabeth felt the appeal of it, the seductive promise of escape. But something in her resisted, the same stubborn core that had kept her in Englewood when everyone told her to leave. "And option 2? You stay in Chicago. Under my protection. Permanent guards, secure housing, every resource I have at your disposal." His voice was steady but his eyes betrayed the cost of what he was offering. "But you stay yourself, Elizabeth Crawford, with your community center, your church, your life. The danger never fully goes away. My enemies will always know you exist. You'll always be looking over your shoulder." "Why would anyone choose that?" Elizabeth asked. "Because some people would rather live in danger as themselves than in safety as someone else." He met her eyes. "I won't judge which you choose. Both are reasonable. Both are yours to take." Elizabeth stood, pacing to the window where Chicago's lights sprawled toward the horizon. Her city. Her home. The place she'd built a life through 40 years of service and sacrifice. Could she really walk away from all of it? Start over at 68 in some anonymous suburb where no one knew her name? She thought of her students at the community center. The elderly folks who depended on her blood pressure checks. The Sunday choir that needed her alto voice. All the small ways she'd woven herself into the fabric of her neighborhood. "I'm staying," she said finally, turning to face him. "But if I'm tied to your world, then your world will be tied to my values." Masakazu's eyebrow raised slightly. Meaning you use that money, all that blood money, to do something good. Community health clinics. Addiction recovery programs. Housing for people who need it." Her voice strengthened, nurse's authority replacing fear. "You want to protect me? Fine. But you'll also fund the things I care about. You'll become the weapon I use to heal this city." For a long moment Masakazu simply stared at her. Then unexpectedly he smiled. A real smile, small but genuine, the first she'd seen from him. "You're extorting a Yakuza boss." "I'm negotiating terms," Elizabeth corrected. "Do we have a deal?" Masakazu extended his good hand. "We have a deal." Their handshake sealed a partnership neither had anticipated. A criminal and a healer, bound together by violence and circumstance, about to discover what happened when moral clarity met absolute power. Elizabeth's new business cards arrived 3 weeks later, embossed on heavy cream stock. Elizabeth Crawford, Humanitarian Advisor, Hino Enterprises. The title was deliberately vague, the kind that could mean anything or nothing depending on who asked. To Masakazu's organization it meant everything. Her first project was a free health clinic in Englewood, funded through a labyrinth of shell corporations and anonymous donations that made the money functionally untraceable. Elizabeth hired the staff herself. Nurses who'd been laid off from underfunded hospitals, a retired doctor who'd lost his practice to medical debt, community health workers who knew every family on every block. The Crawford Community Health Center opened on a cold November morning, offering free blood pressure screenings, diabetes management, and prenatal care to a neighborhood that had been medically abandoned for decades. Masakazu attended the ribbon cutting, standing at the back of the crowd in an expensive overcoat, flanked by Kenji and two other guards. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention. But when Elizabeth looked back and met his eyes, something passed between them, an acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. The Addiction Recovery Center came next, then subsidized housing for seniors, then a job training program for formerly incarcerated men. Each project bore Elizabeth's fingerprints, her nurse's pragmatism applied to structural problems the city had given up trying to solve. And each was funded by money that had, days or weeks earlier, come from gambling operations, protection rackets, and trafficking routes that stretched across the Midwest. Elizabeth attended meetings now, sitting quietly in rooms where men discussed shipments and territories and enforcement. Her presence changed the temperature of these gatherings. Masakazu's lieutenants watched their language around her, softened their threats, as if her silent witness reminded them of mothers or grandmothers or some version of themselves they'd abandoned years ago. They started calling her Obasan, grandmother, with a respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with genuine affection. She brought homemade soup when Kenji had the flu. She remembered birthdays. She asked about children and wives and aging parents, treating these violent men as human beings who happened to do terrible things, rather than monsters wearing human faces. "You're reforming them," Masakazu observed one evening as they reviewed budgets for the new community center. "I'm reminding them," Elizabeth corrected, not looking up from the spreadsheet. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Reformation suggests they can change what they are. Reminder suggests they already know what they should be." She met his eyes. "You'll know. You've just gotten very good at ignoring it." Masakazu absorbed this without argument. Elizabeth had earned the right to speak truths he'd spent years avoiding. She was under no illusions about what she'd become. The conscience of a criminal empire, a woman who took blood money and transformed it into healing while never forgetting where it came from. Some nights she lay awake wrestling with the moral mathematics of it, calculating whether the good she funded outweighed the harm its source caused. She never found an answer that satisfied her completely. But she kept working anyway because the people in those clinics needed help regardless of where the money came from, and because she'd learned that absolute moral purity was a luxury reserved for people who'd never watched someone die for lack of resources. 3 months after the kidnapping, Elizabeth sat in Masakazu's penthouse reviewing proposals for a youth mentorship program. He watched her work, this elderly woman who'd somehow bent his entire organization toward purposes it was never meant to serve. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying?" Elizabeth considered the question with her characteristic honesty. "Every day. And not at all." She looked up from the documents. "I regret the violence, the danger, the compromises. But I don't regret the clinics, the people we've helped, the lives we've saved." She paused. "And I don't regret believing you're capable of being more than what you've been. I'm still a criminal, Mrs. Crawford." "I know." Her smile was sad but genuine. "But you're also the reason 200 people got free medical care last month. You're complicated, Mr. Hino. Most people are." Mahizu nodded slowly, accepting this assessment of himself. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but acknowledgement that even in darkness, small lights could be kindled by those brave enough to strike the match. The spring sun broke through Chicago's clouds on the morning of the grand opening, casting warm light across the freshly painted facade of the Crawford Community Health Center. A crowd of 200 had gathered. Neighborhood residents, former patients, church members, city officials who'd been persuaded to attend through channels they'd never quite understand. Elizabeth stood at the entrance holding oversized scissors, flanked by the nursing staff she'd personally recruited. She wore a simple navy dress and her Sunday pearls, her silver hair styled neatly, her posture straight despite the lingering ache in her ribs that cold weather still triggered. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd spent her life in service and had somehow found a way to continue that service through the most unlikely of partnerships. "This center," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd, "represents what's possible when we refuse to abandon each other. When we choose to see the humanity in our neighbors and act on it." She didn't mention the funding source. Didn't acknowledge the man watching from across the street. It's proof that even in the hardest circumstances, healing can take root. He cut the ribbon. Applause erupted. The doors opened and people streamed inside to tour examination rooms equipped with technology most public hospitals couldn't afford. a pharmacy stocked with medications that would be dispensed free of charge, waiting rooms designed with dignity rather than efficiency in mind. Masakazu watched from beside a black Mercedes, Kenji and two other guards flanking him at respectful distances. He wore sunglasses despite the clouds, his suit immaculate, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. To the casual observer, he was just another businessman watching a community event. To those who knew, he was the invisible architect of everything Elizabeth had built. She looked back across the street, found him in the crowd and nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, she'd been clear about that from the beginning. It wasn't redemption, he was still who he'd always been, running an empire built on exploitation and violence. It was simply acknowledgement. Recognition that even in darkness, light could be carved out by those brave enough to demand it. And that sometimes the most unlikely people could become instruments of grace. Masakazu nodded back, a gesture so subtle only someone watching for it would catch it. Then he slipped into the Mercedes and disappeared into Chicago traffic, back to the world of shadows and calculated violence that Elizabeth would never fully enter but could no longer pretend didn't exist. 3 weeks later, Carlos Reyes was found dead in a Detroit warehouse, his throat cut, his organization systematically dismantled by coordinated strikes that bore Masakazu's signature precision. The message was clear. Those who threatened what Masakazu protected would be eliminated with absolute prejudice. 2 days after that, the driver who'd hit Elizabeth in the crosswalk, a 26-year-old investment banker named Connor Walsh, was arrested after an anonymous tip led police to evidence he'd been trying to destroy for months. Security footage from 3 angles, paint transfer analysis, cell phone records proving he'd been texting while driving. His trial lasted 4 days. He was sentenced to 8 years. Elizabeth read about both events in the newspaper over morning coffee in her new apartment. A secure building in Bronzeville with actual heat and windows that locked properly, though she'd insisted on staying in the South Side despite Masakazu's offers of luxury condos downtown. She noted the news without comment, understanding perfectly well who'd orchestrated both outcomes, and returned to reviewing applications for the Addiction Recovery Center's first cohort of residents. Elizabeth Crawford, who'd once been left bleeding on a rain-soaked street while strangers filmed her dying, had become the most protected woman in Chicago. Guards shadowed her movements with professional discretion. Her calls were monitored for threats. Her building had security that rivaled federal facilities. And somewhere in a downtown penthouse, a man who'd ordered murders and destroyed lives checked in daily to ensure she was safe, healthy, and equipped with whatever resources she needed to continue healing the communities his empire had helped damage. It was complicated. It was morally ambiguous. It was absolutely nothing like the life she'd imagined during her 40 years as a nurse. But as Elizabeth watched elderly residents walk through the clinic doors for free care they'd been denied everywhere else, as she reviewed plans for the youth center that would open next month, as she felt the weight of purpose she thought she'd lost when she retired, she understood something fundamental. Grace was rarely simple, goodness was often purchased at terrible cost, and sometimes the only way to change the world was to stand in the middle of its worst darkness and insist on bringing light anyway. She was no saint. Masakazu was no reformed man. But together they'd created something that mattered. A covenant forged in violence and sustained by the stubborn belief that even blood money could be transformed into healing if someone was brave enough to demand it. The phone on her desk buzzed. A text from an unknown number that she knew by heart. The youth center funding cleared. Construction starts Monday. Elizabeth smiled despite herself, typed back a simple thank you and returned to her work. There were always more people to help, more programs to build, more ways to carve light from darkness. And she had the resources of a criminal empire at her disposal. She intended to use every penny of it,